Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Great Exhibition Road Festival event. This is a 2-minute warning until the Unloved Animal Club Creatures in the Climate Crisis. Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to this Great Exhibition Road Festival event. From a great weekend of talks, workshops and performances across South Kensington over the weekend, the festival has been continuing in the festival spirit online this week as well, with poignant talks, in-depth discussions and some family fun. This evening, I'll be your host, so let me introduce myself. I'm Patrick, a PhD student studying at Imperial College London and the Natural History Museum, which is where I'm at now. My research is looking to understand biodiversity responses to environmental pressures, such as land use and climate change. I'm also part of the Biodiversity COP and Communication Challenge team, who have partnered with the Great Exhibition Road Festival to bring you this event this evening. As I'm sure most of you are aware, this festival and event is being held amidst two exceptionally important conferences that will determine how we collectively deal with both the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. The Climate COP, COP26, is being held in Glasgow next month, and the Biodiversity COP is currently being held virtually in preparation for the in-person conference next year. In tackling these crises, it's become more and more apparent that these issues cannot be solved independently, and there are many actions that can benefit both nature and the climate, foremost of which is the protection, restoration, and proper management of the natural world. Therefore, in light of this, the Unloved Animal Club is taking a climate twist. Previously, we've highlighted those underappreciated animals whose contributions to us have gone overlooked for far too long, and showed that no matter how obscure the animal, all biodiversity is essential to our life on Earth. This time, we're continuing the same, but we're considering animals that are threatened by climate change. By putting these species in the spotlight and advocating for their appreciation and protection, we hope not only be highlighting the impact of a changing climate across the globe, but also that by protecting these animals, we can create a more hospitable and sustainable planet, not just for biodiversity, but for us as humans. So this just brings me on to the event this evening, and why we're all here, the Unloved Animals Club, Creatures in Climate Crisis. We've gathered 7 scientists to show their affection for their favorite creatures in crisis. Each will have roughly 5 minutes to persuade you why their animal deserves your love. Afterwards, we have a Q&A session so that the audience can ask your burning questions. Following the Q&A, we will have an opportunity to vote on which animal has won you over best, although I'm sure everyone would have done so. We have put a Mentimeter link in the chat now, so we can have it open and ready for your vote at the end. While voting, the poet extraordinaire Robin Lamboll will recite a poem bringing our theme to life. So finally, before I introduce our first speaker, a couple of quick housekeeping points. This event is being recorded and streamed on YouTube, and we do encourage participation and questions in the chat during the event, but please do remain respectful. We want to create a welcoming space for this online conversation, so whilst we love passion and enthusiasm, let's avoid anything that disrupts the experience for others. And please do tag us on social media using the hashtag X Road Fest. So without much further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Abby Crocker is a PhD student at Imperial College London, and will be representing North America, and we'll be talking about the California condor. So please, Abby, take it away. Abby, I believe you're muted. Always one.
Sorry, always one, and it'll be the one that starts. Sorry, everyone. So yeah, hi everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Patrick. My research focuses on the causes and consequences of wildfires in protected areas, which are often associated with high biodiversity and are a focus of conservation activities, such as in the case of the California condor, the largest North American bird species, and I'm going to be talking to you about this species this evening. Next slide, please. The condor is a New World vulture, meaning that they originate in the Americas and are one of 7 extant New World species. So New World and Old World vultures are not closely related, yet they've convergently evolved to exhibit similar traits and behaviors. The main similarity is that they are all scavengers and feed on carrion. Like other vultures, California condors clean up the environment by consuming entire carcasses, including the bones, that would otherwise be left to rot. Therefore, they prevent harmful bacteria from entering soil and water systems and endangering human and ecosystem health. To do this, they have highly acidic stomachs that kill the disease-spreading bacteria. They are also typically bald and perform urohydrosis, whereby they urinate down their legs to kill any bacteria and parasites that may have accumulated when in contact with the carcass. And when spotted resting in the hieratic pose, which is what you can see on the left, they are likely baking the bacteria off their wings, so it may not be a surprise that they are unloved. However, the California condor, like other New World vultures, exhibits some divergent traits from their Old World counterparts. Firstly, they do not possess a voice box, and they can only hiss and grunt. They also have weak feet and weaker and smaller beaks, so they are unable to grasp with their feet and pierce fresh carcasses. This makes them second in command at kill sites to none other than their primary competitor, the golden eagle, who possesses strong grasping feet and large talons. To avoid these competitive situations, their beaks, feet, and keen sense of smell makes them better adapted to locating and consuming older carcasses. The condor's life history relates to the traits that directly affect its survival and reproductive capacity. The condor is one of the heaviest birds in the world, weighing between 18 and 31 pounds, having a body size of 3.5 to 4.5 feet, and a wingspan of 9 to 10 feet. Due to their size and weight, they soar on thermals rather than flap, and this is to conserve energy. This means they are strongly influenced by seasonal changes in atmospheric conditions and cannot forage in bad weather conditions or after daylight hours. However, their large wingspan facilitates long-distance travel in search for food, and in the summer months, they've been documented to fly over 150 miles to foraging grounds. Condors can live up to 60 to 70 years in the wild, though they do not acquire adult plumage until they are 6 years old, and they do not reproduce prior to this. During this period, they are particularly susceptible to environmental disturbance. After this, they will find a mate and lay 1 egg every 1 to 2 years. The incubation period lasts approximately 50 days, and chicks remain in the nest for approximately 5 months. And after fledging, they have an extended juvenile dependency period of several months where they rely fully dependent on their parents for food. So this can preclude any nesting cycle the following year. Such low reproductive rates, long period of sexual immaturity, demographic stochasticity, meaning the kind of uneven spatial and temporal distributions of sex and age, which is particularly a problem in smaller populations, and nest failure help explain why recruitment in condors is exceptionally low. Next slide, please. The condor historically ranged from British Columbia, Canada, to Baja California, Mexico, and across the southern states to Florida. The condor population began to decline in the 1800s, and in the 1950s, there were less than 100 in the wild, and this resulted in their protection in 1967. However, their numbers continued to decline until there were only 22 individuals left in the wild in 1982, and then they were declared extinct in the wild soon after. The dramatic decline in their survival and reproductive rates was due to a combination of threats, which I'm about to outline, of which were intensified by a decline of breeding age individuals. And this can be explained by the alley effect, which is where the threat of extinction rises at critical low population densities due to undercrowding. And unlike most of the rest of North America, much of the Pacific coast, particularly the California region, was not colonized by the Europeans until the 1800s. And the influx of settlers, farmers, ranchers, miners who established and developed their activities across this landscape caused the California's decline. So this was due to shootings out of either poaching or believing they were harmful to people and livestock, energy production and mining, utility and service lines, with electrocution being a leading source of death, biological resource use, including trapping, hunting, and egg poaching, invasive species and new diseases, pollution, so the introduction of chemical pesticides such as DDT, which is consumed by condors through bottom-up food web interactions and has been found to cause eggshell thinning and hence a reduction in reproductive success. Their primary threat and leading cause of decline was, and still is, the development and continued use of high-velocity, high-power lead-based ammunition, causing lead poisoning through the consumption of medium to large-bodied mammal carcasses, including deer, coyotes, and livestock. So there are now additional threats to the California condor due to rapid climate change and related feedback processes, such as drought and fires, which I will come back to very shortly. Next slide, please. The California condor is increasingly making a comeback since they were declared extinct in the wild in 1987, when the remaining 22 individuals were brought into captivity by the US Fish and Wildlife Service and multiple other associated groups. They began a large-scale ex situ breeding and reintroduction program. The ongoing ex situ program includes aversion training, such as avoiding dangerous sites and electricity poles, adult mentors for juveniles, the use of puppet parents for chicks to facilitate consecutive breeding years, and food testing. In 1992, the first condor was reintroduced into the wild, and now the total population in captivity and the wild now exceeds 500 individuals. Their current range is centered in California, but now extends over Arizona, Utah, and Mexico. Next slide, please. Lead poisoning remains the condor's greatest threat. Despite the signing of the Ridley Tree Condor Preservation Act and Assembly Bill 711, which requires the use of non-lead ammunition for killing all wildlife species throughout California, it can still be used for livestock. Condors frequently visit ranches for foraging, and due to increased drought conditions across the US West, such visits are becoming more frequent in search for food and water. This puts them in much greater contact with humans, increasing their likelihood of human-wildlife conflict and increasing their interaction with and consumption of plastic, which is now found in their stomachs, and microplastics have been found in the stomachs of chicks, and this is now a leading cause of death. The third biggest killer of the species in recent history is wildfires in the US West. As we are aware, wildfires are increasing in size, intensity, frequency, and duration, and in California, 15 of the 20 largest fires ever recorded have occurred since 2000. This is due to a combination of an increase in wildfire-prone weather conditions, such as low humidity, high temperature, and strong winds, and also a history of fire suppression policy, which resulted in accumulation of fuel, such as grasses, tree debris, and leaf litter. An example of the devastating effects of wildfires on condor populations is the 2020 Dolan fire, which burnt nearly 125,000 acres along California's central coast, including Big Sur, killing several condors and destroying research facilities which have been used by condor scientists for more than 20 years. Although condors can fly out of the way of fire activity, the speed at which fires spread, combined with the fact they roost as large groups and chicks remain in nests for an extended period, puts them at a greater risk of being wiped out by a single large fire event. The smoke caused by fires and their inability to forage during adverse weather conditions further exacerbates this threat. So due to these ongoing threats, the condor population is heavily managed in and ex situ, with wild condors often being trapped and operated on to remove plastics and fragmented pollutants. So the biggest challenge now is how to ensure their long-term sustainability and ability to self-sustain themselves in the wild. Firstly, lead-based ammunition needs to be completely banned. Secondly, plastic production, consumption, and waste needs to be significantly reduced. And lastly, we really need to address climate change now and reduce our impact on the environment. There'll be a link put in the chat of how we can achieve this in 9 simple steps. And before I leave you on that one, I just want to share something that might make you love the condor just that tiny bit more. Mankind has learned that New World vultures have a keen sense of smell, and when natural gas has no odor, they've used a substance called ethyl mercaptan to add to it, and this closely resembles the odor given off by decaying flesh. So natural gas employers now use large congregations of New World vultures to help locate breaks or leaks in natural gas lines. So maybe we can give back to them what they've given to us. Thank you.
Brilliant. Abby, thank you so much. Being a good advocate for the California condor there. Amazing. So we're going to be moving swiftly on to our next continent. Is going to be South America, and we have Alex Lees, who is a senior lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University, as a lifelong ornithologist who's happiest in tropical forests. So very fitting, he'll be pitching to you the wing-banded antbird, which resides in the forests of South America. So thank you for being here, Alex, and please take it away.
Okay, thank you, Patrick.
Muted. There you go. Back on.
Yep, brilliant. Okay, so I'm based at MMU, and I've been working on Amazonian conservation issues for about 18 years now. First, ended up starting working in the basin in 2003, ended up falling into a PhD, and eventually ended up moving out there, and then spent sort of 5 years working at Museo Parense Emilio Gelgi. So quite a substantial part of my sort of adult life has been spent in the tropics, and I've sort of always been a really, really keen birder, and I had sort of always had this sort of internal list of some of the things I've liked to see, and one of those birds is this very odd small understory perching bird called the wing-banded antbird. Now, antbirds are a group of very species-rich neotropical birds, tend to often occur in the understory and sort of mid-story of Amazonian forests. You sometimes get up to 40 or more species in some of these forests. And the wing-banded antbird's a real oddity among them. It's within a group of sort of terrestrial understory species, which are quite sensitive to change, which we'll go on to talk about. But it's also sort of evolutionarily very, very distinct. It sits on its own sort of branch of the evolutionary tree of life of these antbirds, and it's quite distinct from all remaining species. So it's a real bit of a sort of oddball bird. So this first picture is actually a picture of mine taken with flash, and this is one without flash, basically. So it's actually a very sort of cryptically coloured species, and quite difficult to spot unless you hear the bird's distinctive song. So I'm hoping you guys can hear this. But it's sort of a series of high-pitched whistles which draw attention to it, but they're difficult to come by because they're a very low-density species. So there's only one pair for every, maybe 100 hectares or more of good quality forest. And they're kind of like, for other birders, might sort of recognize this species here, a turnstone. So they creep around on the forest floor and they're flipping leaves looking for large invertebrates, basically. Or it's almost like kind of the avian equivalent, the avian equivalent of like a hedgehog almost. So they're sort of small, dumpy little rattan birds which shuffles around in the understory and flips leaves looking for its invertebrate prey items, basically. Now, wing-banded antbirds are impacted by various different sort of agents of human change in tropical forest. So they're not a species which can at all occur outside of forest habitat. So if you replace forest with fields with cows in them, or fields of soya, which are essentially food for cows, then you tend to lose all the species of antbirds, not just the wing-banded antbird. Although some antbirds are resilient, for instance, to forest degradation. So forest degradation is a process of reduction of habitat quality by forest fires, for instance, or by selective logging. Now, although some antbirds can persist in these degraded forests, wing-banded antbird isn't one of those species because it likes this sort of quite open and humid forest understory. And by basically removing trees, you end up with this fresh spurt of new growth in the understory, which blocks out the habitat of this species in these more open understory habitats. And then fire as well has the same sort of consequences. It changes the microclimate there, and then leads to sort of desiccation, the drying of the understory leaf litter. And you often get different pioneer tree species moving in with big leaves, which this antbird can't toss away, if you like. So it tends to disappear from these sorts of habitats. So really restricted to what sort of ecologists call undisturbed primary forest habitats within Amazonia, and indeed, as you can see on the sort of top right here, where they live in also parts of Central America as well. Now, the wing-banded antbird is quite a worrying species because not only is it a species which disappears in habitats which have been in forest habitats which have been replaced, which are no longer forest. Not only does it not occur in forest habitats which have been degraded by fire or by logging, it seems that the species is also disappearing in areas of undisturbed forest where it's historically common. So a graph on the left here basically shows the abundance change. Two graphs. On the left is the abundance change of species in primary forest habitats. On the right is sort of an indication of the tolerance of species by degradation. Now, this is a long list of birds. It comes from studies at the Biological Dynamics of Fragments project in Manaus, which is somewhere, not like where I've worked in the southern Amazonia, where we've got all these problems with the encroachment and this deforestation frontier pushing into the forest and replacing it. This is from an area which is, still very, very pristine, very, very low human impact. But what we've seen is that wing-banded antbird is disappearing from within these areas of intact forest. It's not a surprise to see it disappearing from forest fragments because we know it's a species which requires large areas of well-preserved forest, but it's very scary to see this species disappearing from what ostensibly should be good quality habitat. Now, people have worked on this bird in Manaus. Their only working hypothesis for what's changed in the region is the climate. And you see on the lower right here is a modeled map looking at expected changes in temperatures across South America. And you can see that in large parts of the eastern Amazonia and northern Amazonia, we're seeing decreases in rainfall. Now, this decreases in rainfall leads to the desiccation of forests, which not only makes them more vulnerable to fire, which again, fires also interact with logging, so log forests are more likely to burn. But this desiccation then leads to these changes in the understory habitats of species. It leads to declines in invertebrate populations, which are being detected in many tropical forests. And it's likely driving the loss of this species, from within undisturbed forest habitats, which is an incredibly sort of scary thought to think that, we can do everything we can to protect in situ Amazonian forests, but the survival of many species may be due to these far broader global impacts from climate change. So this is sort of a plea for folks to think about global impacts on tropical forest birds and not just local impacts, and to recognise, what would be incredibly awful for us to lose this sort of super evolutionary, distinctive and weird little understory, little brown job, if you like.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Alex. I'm very jealous of the time that you've spent in the tropical rainforest. Sounds great. And a good pitch for the wing-banded antbird. I guess we're going to be moving on next. So we've sort of had the tropical forest, nice warm place. But now we're going to the cold reaches of the Antarctic oceans with Professor Lloyd Peck, who with the British Antarctic Survey has been to Antarctica many times, often dive in the cold waters studying his animal today, the ice fish. So thank you, Lloyd, and please talk to us about this amazing animal.
Okay, hello. I'm Lloyd Peck. I work at the British Antarctic Survey, and I'm an ecologist, biologist who works in the seas around the Antarctic. So I'm going to talk to you about a very unusual group of fish that live at the southern reaches of the world, and they're unloved for many reasons. I'll come back to that later on. I'm going to start off by talking to you a little bit about the continent itself and some of its life. So we know a few things about the Antarctic. It's very cold. It's the coldest place on Earth. It's the highest average altitude continent on Earth, and it's the driest and the windiest. It's 99% covered in ice. Around 90% of the world's ice is there, and 3/4 of the world's fresh water is there. Next slide, please. So when we think about the Antarctic, most of us think about scenes like this. It's ice covered, it's denuded, and most of us think nothing lives there. But that's a long, long way from the truth. It is cold. And in the oceans, the temperatures run between about -2 to +2 to 3 during the year. And it's been cold and constant temperature like that for somewhere between 15 and 25 million years for at least parts of the Antarctic. And that's allowed some of the world's most unusual and bizarre animals to adapt and evolve in those conditions. Next slide, please. It's not the easiest place to work. So divers in the summer can be faced with sea that is full of ice, blocks of ice, that makes it very difficult to go and work on the seabed or in the ocean with the animals living there. Next slide, please. In the wintertime, we pull out a 5-foot chainsaw and we cut holes in the ice to dive through so we can look at what's going on in the wintertime. Slide, please. And we dive through those holes that are cut in the ice. We use dry suits. When we first went down 30 years ago, we were in wetsuits and it wasn't quite as comfortable. Next slide, please. Well, most of us, when we think about the things that live in the Antarctic, in the oceans, we think about all of these iconic animals like the seals, the penguins, and the whales. And yes, they are iconic. And the Attenborough programs, the Life in the Freezer, they've all shown us what these animals are like. But they're not what biodiversity in the Antarctic, in the seas, is really all about. Next slide, please. This is a picture, a typical picture from the seabed in the Antarctic at about 20 meters depth. And the seabed is both diverse and abundant in terms of what lives there. Over 8,000 species of marine invertebrates and fish have been described from the seabed in the Antarctic so far. It's estimated that somewhere between 17 and 20,000 species live on the seabed in the Antarctic. That's as diverse as most temperate seabeds and many tropical seabeds outside of coral reefs. So the idea that nothing lives in the polar regions is just wrong. It is a diverse and very abundant seabed in Antarctica. Next slide, please. So some animals that live on the seabed are bizarre, and I've got one here, and I think we're going to blow this up a little bit so you can see. Some animals grow very large. This is a sea spider, and it's not one of the biggest sea spiders in the Antarctic. The biggest ones are over 0.5 meter across, and they're thousands of times bigger than the biggest sea spiders that we get in the temperate regions. And there are lots of very unusual animals. Now, I'm not putting the sea spiders up as the most unloved animal, because there are some that I think are even more unloved than these. Thank you. And those species are the ice fish, or at least this group of ice fish. All the fish in Antarctica have antifreeze because their blood freezes at -0.5 degree and their temperatures in the sea go down to -2 every year. But this group of fish, 16 species of this group, the Chinichthyid ice fish, they don't have red blood cells. They are the only animals on Earth with backbones that don't have red blood cells. They are biologically different and unique in a way that no other animals with backbones on this planet are. Next slide, please. So because of that, they can become almost invisible. And the only color that you can see on this picture, the pink, is the food that this ice fish is eating. These fish can only exist because the temperatures are low and constantly low. So the low temperature means these fish have metabolic rates that are around 20 to 30 times lower than similar fish in the tropics. And that reduction in the cost of living means they can survive without the oxygen carried in red blood cells, in hemoglobin, like the red blood cells that makes our blood red. And for us and every other animal with a backbone that has red blood cells, 95 to 98% of the oxygen is carried around their bodies in the red blood cells. These fish survive on the other 2 to 5%. If it warms up, their metabolic rates are forced up by the warming and they just can't cope. Next slide, please. So if we look at these fish in a little bit more detail, this is one of those species on the top part of the slide. The bottom part of the slide on the right shows blood from one of our red-blooded Antarctic fish, and in the top vial, blood from one of the chinichthyid fish that doesn't have red blood cells. On the left side at the bottom panel is a heart from one of the red-blooded fish in Antarctica and from one of our fish without red blood cells. Now, the red-blooded fish in Antarctica already have big hearts compared to fish elsewhere, 30, 40, 50% bigger than the hearts of fish elsewhere. In the fish that lack red blood cells, their hearts are 5 times bigger than most fish of a similar size in the temperate zones. And that's because they have to pump a lot of blood. They pump it slowly, but with a big volume. And their blood volume is higher. So they have some really unusual adaptations. Next slide, please. One of those adaptations is in their blood capillaries. All animals with backbones, except these fish, have capillaries that are the same size, give or take 10 or 20%. So that's true for all the birds on the planet, all the mammals on the planet, all the lions, all the tigers, all the squirrels, and all the fish on the planet. They all have the same capillary ends in terms of size, plus or minus 10 to 20%. In these ice fish, those capillaries are 4 times the diameter of any other vertebrate on the planet. These animals are biologically unique. Next slide, please. So, they are looked at as some of the ugliest animals on Earth, and some people really find them difficult to look at and handle when they come across them. Very few biologists have seen these ice fish. They are out of sight, out of mind, because they're in one of the most remote parts of the planet. So they're unloved on several scales, because we don't see them very often, because they're ugly. But they are biologically unique in a way that none of the things that we're desperate to conserve, like eagles, like elephants, like polar bears, like tree frogs. But their loss to biodiversity on the planet would be greater than any other species. They have a poorer capacity to cope with a warming environment because they don't have red blood cells. So they are one of the animals that is closest to being wiped out by warming. And they're unloved because they're a long, long way from anywhere anybody lives. And they are pretty ugly, really. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lloyd. I don't think they're that ugly, but I can see why they're a bit unloved. But yeah, no, thank you so much. Yeah, very jealous of your time in Antarctica, and I can imagine it's quite cold going down in the wetsuit when it's 1 or 2 degrees.
Yeah, it is. I've done 800 dives in Antarctica. The kit we've got now means you can dive comfortably for half an hour, 3/4 of an hour. My longest dive's at 76 minutes. So you can't be that cold to do a 76-minute dive.
Oh, brilliant. Well, thank you so much. So yeah, that brings us from Antarctica onto our next continent, which is Australasia's next. Is our next on our tour around the world. And there we have Dr. Paul Pearce-Kelly, Senior Curator of Invertebrates, Lower Vertebrates and Research at the Zoological Society of London, or ZSL. And he'll be advocating for the black sea cucumber or the lollyfish. Which are quite obscure. I'm sure Paul will be able to enthuse our passion for them by the end of his talk. So Paul, please take us away and tell us about your creature. Oh, and that's muted again, I believe.
Yes, hello, and thank you for the opportunity to join colleagues this evening. So here we have one of our tropical reef tanks at the London Zoo, at the Zoological Society of London. Often we think of reefs as, of course, the corals and the reef fish, but there's a whole wealth of biodiversity associated with these and other systems. Next slide, please. And you can see maybe a little black blob down on the left-hand side. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, there it is. Quite clear now. Next slide, please. Let's zoom in on the little fella. There he is again. Next slide, please. Welcome to the black sea cucumber, or the lollyfish, as it's often called as well, Holothera atra. You can just see his or her adorable tentacles. It's impossible to tell what sex they are from the outside. Next slide, please. So another example of the wonderful sea cucumbers. Next slide, please. So what's so special about a sea cucumber? Next slide, please. Okay, well, fisheries, slide's gone a bit funny, but never mind. The fisheries, they're incredibly important fishery species. Lots of different species, not the actual black sea cucumber in particular, but many others, and lots of work on the fisheries impacts has shown that huge financial value to the world in terms of many of the poorest regions, and incredibly important fisheries element, some of which are actually over collected now, so that's something to bear in mind. And a wealth of pharmaceuticals, incredible range of chemicals, various antibacterial agents, etc., found in these critters. So very interesting from that perspective and valuable to the world. The sea cucumber might end up saving your life one day, but also a major ecosystem role. Next slide, please. Yeah, it's a bit hard to show you these slides because they're all white and they have a black background, so I'm not quite sure what happened there. But they are slow motion heroes. They are. We know about the earthworms do a wonderful job on the land of turning the nutrients over in the soil, bioturbation it's called. Well, these sea cucumbers are effectively the principal agents doing that in the marine environment, and incredibly important for maintaining healthy ecosystems, particularly in seagrass meadows, coral reefs, and on the deep ocean floor as well. So really, really important. They are not only that, but they're generating calcium carbonate for corals, which they can then help to create strong skeletons and have healthy reefs. They help to maintain oxygen levels and have a healthy oxygen rate within the actual seabed, and that can be incredibly valuable to other species reliant on those species to actually provide that level. And they also even help to guard against or to cope with ocean acidification, because again, their actual waste products, the prodigious amounts of poop they actually produce have an alkaline property which helps to mitigate the ocean acidification. And they have a range of other eco-health roles as well. They help to keep algae in check, so it stops algae getting a natural dominant position within the reef and moving from a reef dominated position. All kinds of things, all that, and they don't even have a brain. Think about that. So there's some wonderful publications which I put onto this presentation, which I hope people get a chance to read, and you can just get an insight just how valuable they are. Next slide, please. Thank you. I just want to flag up the background of the biodiversity crisis, and we've heard about these wonderful animals, and we'll hear about the others shortly. They're all facing a similar issue. If anything that's not found to be very significantly threatened, it's probably just not been looked at closely enough. And the latest reports of the biodiversity review, over 1 million species identified as or estimated as being in real trouble. And that's probably a way underestimate, because it doesn't pick up like the 830 odd estimated species reliant on coral reef ecosystems, for instance. Next slide, please. And if you look at the whole system level, the actual lollyfish really is a poster cucumber really for showing the biodiversity wealth that's in these systems, and the fact that these ecosystem level viability crisis we're looking at, not a species crisis, the whole damn ecosystem, be it warm water coral reefs, seagrass meadows, pretty much anything in the marine environment you want to think about. Next slide, please. And these, of course, aren't linear threats. They can go into completely altered states, and that's something we really need to flag up as much as possible. So, I'm sure colleagues have heard about tipping points and transitional states, etc. And that's exactly what we're looking at with a lot of these marine environments, and of course on terrestrial systems. And you just heard a colleague talking about the Amazon earlier. Next slide, please. So we sure as hell can't leave it up to the sea cucumbers. Invaluable role they are providing for us out there in the marine environment and keeping these systems healthy, or doing their best to. It's going to need as much active awareness and engagement and effective policy to maintain these systems and to keep them viable. And we need to keep in mind that for all the species we're talking about, the actual current trajectories we are on, there's not much of a realistic future if you're really looking at the actual trajectories. Next slide, please. So we just really need to focus on those realities and keep in mind that we're all in it together. And I think the lollyfish is an example, again, as I said, of what we stand to lose. The incredible complexity of these ecosystems, how they work. You can't just save a single coral or a single coral reef fish. They're all reliant on these interactive elements. And ultimately, of course, it's a global system too. So I think I will end there and just flag up the wonderful work that is done for these incredible critters to our advantage, humanity's advantage, but also keeping these ecosystems going. So I would urge, never mind the competition side of it, look at some of those references there and amaze yourself what a wonderful world it is and what we stand to lose.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. Yeah, I think that's a good point, that we need to just maintain the structure and the intactness of our ecosystems by protecting everything, and not just those charismatic animals. And often the sea cucumber and the lollyfish do play those important roles, keeping it all together. So yeah, thank you. Amazing. So that was Australasia. And next up on our tour is we are in Asia and the Indian Ocean. But unfortunately, our Asia representative, Rosie Dow, is unable to be with us this evening. She would be with us, but she actually can't speak. So we have a last-minute stand-in, and Asia's saving grace, Kerry Webster, will give Rosie's talk. Both Rosie and Kerry are PhD students at the Zoological Society of London, studying animals in the marine realm. Kerry will be talking about the Chagos brain coral. So thank you very much, both Kerry and Rosie, and please take it away.
Thanks, Patrick. Hi, everyone. I'm Kerry Webster, and as Patrick said, I'm a second-year PhD student. I work with Rosie in the marine department at the Institute of Zoology, and I'm here today to present her Unloved Animal. So I'm here with a species representing Asia, and more specifically the Indian Ocean. And I know what you're thinking, though not everyone loves coral reefs and knows that they're having a difficult time. So I want to pitch to you more of an unknown rather than unloved species, and potentially the rarest coral in the world, the Chagos brain coral. Next slide, please. So as I said, the Chagos brain coral, or Tenella chagius, is thought to be one of the rarest in the world, with the distribution limited only to the remote Chagos archipelago in the Indian Ocean. It is a monotypic genus, meaning that it only contains this one species. So excuse me, but from here on, I'll refer to it as just Tenella. So the Chagos archipelago is a collection of atolls, including the Earth's largest, the Great Chagos Bank, sitting roughly 1,000 kilometers south of the Maldives. Due to some complicated political reasons, it's home to coral reefs that have been largely undisturbed by humans for the last 15 years. However, nowadays, these reefs are protected both by their remote location and the creation of one of the world's largest no-take marine reserves, the British Indian Ocean Territory Marine Protected Area. Currently, only one of the islands is inhabited by humans, Diego Garcia, with the only other inhabitant of note being a lonely donkey on Ili du Coin in Perils Banos. Scientists have been studying these reefs over the last 50 years, and some estimates indicate the Chagos archipelago may contain more than half of the healthy coral reefs remaining in the entire Indian Ocean, and so is an important hotspot for coral diversity globally. Next slide, please. In the 1970s, Tenella was one of the 25 most common corals found in the Chagos archipelago. It has an elegantly patterned brain-like hemisphere distinguished by the long, smooth, and meandering valleys on its surface. And as you can see in this beautiful picture on the top left, the coral tentacles are commonly extended above the calyces during the day. Density data and colony size collected by a leading researcher in Chagos science, Professor Charles Shepherd, in the 1970s revealed the skeleton of the largest Tenella colonies approached 1/4 ton each, so often beach ball size or bigger. And so with its abundance, it was one of the main limestone depositors that built the archipelago's reef. Professor Shepherd also measured its calcification and photosynthetic rates and calculated that colonies could likely live more than 100 years. It used to be abundant on both ocean-facing and lagoon reefs, but was never found on reef flats or areas that would heat up more in the days. And its distribution suggested it was intolerant of slightly turbid water. As with common corals, it's primarily found at shallower depths, but in exceptionally clear water, one colony was observed as deep as 40 meters. Another key Tenella trait is its fighting ability. It's aggressive when it comes to other corals, and it defends its space by using sweeper tentacles or long digestive filaments that can kill many other species that might encroach onto its patch of reef. Fast-growing branching corals such as aquaphora, next slide please, sorry. So the fast-growing branching corals such as aquaphora in the bottom photograph, which can grow up to 8 centimeters in a year, can easily overtop and shade it. The photograph shows the results of the Tenella's aggressive attack on the aquaphora, preventing it from expanding and robbing it of the light that it needs. Today, however, Tenella's story is grim. When total coral cover on the archipelago's reef fell to 10% after the 1998 warming, it became rather uncommon. Not rare, but no longer abundant. Since the 2015-2016 warming event, it's virtually disappeared. In many hours of diver surveys on an expedition in 2017, it was not seen once, although its dead skeletons were hard to miss. Again, in 2018, there were no living corals found at all, except for small living fragments left on boulders in 2 sites. Whereas its pre-warming numbers were such that about 50 colonies might be seen in any one dive, today we might see it in 1 in 50 dives, a very stark decline. Sadly, Tenella is now ecologically extinct. But the good news is that sightings mean we now know that it isn't taxonomically extinct. But Tenella does not make anything easy. Colonies have never survived translocations to aquariums so far, and a few studies have survived translocations to reefs, but overall it appears to be an incredibly sensitive coral. After the 2015-16 bleaching events, the corals on reefs above 15 meters are in a state of collapse when it comes to both ecological function and their ability to accumulate reef materials. They may recover, and there is plenty of research currently going on to track the current states of the reefs and their recovery. Indeed, given time, even Tenella may achieve its former levels of abundance, although the predictions for increasingly frequent warming events make it difficult to be very optimistic. Next slide. However, I wanted to end on a bit of good news. Next slide, please. Rosie was lucky enough to be part of the 2021 research expedition to Chagos for 5 weeks to collect samples for her PhD research. Her research does not focus on Chagos brain coral directly. Instead, she's using molecular methods such as environmental DNA to investigate eukaryotic communities on shallow reefs across the archipelago. With 5 weeks in the region and an awesome team of 11 scientists funded by the Bertarelli Foundation, they completed 170 dives, totaling a whopping 198 hours and 41 minutes underwater. One of the scientists on this team, Dr. Brian Wilson from the University of Oxford, is the real Tenella expert and did an amazing job getting everyone excited about the rarest coral in the world, often distracting the team from their own work when a colony was found. Over the 2021 expedition, they spotted 61 colonies of critically endangered Chagos brain coral, which were all logged and photographed. This included the juvenile Tenella in the top right. The only evidence of successful breeding that's been recorded since the 2015-16 bleaching event. There are a couple of hotspots where numerous colonies were spotted, but on the whole, these are likely surviving colonies and not ecological viable populations. So that brings me to the end of the pitch, and I hope I've convinced you to find a place in your heart for these incredibly rare and charismatic little coral. Although we've heard it so many times before, Tenella showcases yet again how important it is to protect our oceans and do everything in our power to fight global warming and rising sea temperatures, which could very quickly decimate all of the reefs we know and love. Thank you for listening.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kerry. And yeah, especially thank you because Kerry got roped into this very last minute, probably like maybe 4 or 5 hours ago. So yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, for presenting the Chagos brain coral so well. So that we're almost coming to the end of our world tour, and we only have 2 continents left to visit. So next up, we have the largest continent and our ancestral home, Africa. And speaking for this giant is Tommy de Jorm, an Imperial alumnus who studied a master's here that sought to find a way to recognize African wild dog individuals from photos. So there's no surprise he's talking about African wild dogs. So thank you, Tarman, for being here, and go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about the African wild dog. And since this is the Unloved Animals Club, and I assume that all of you already absolutely adore the African wild dog, I feel like I need to provide some evidence that wild dogs over the last few centuries have actually received very, very little love. Next slide, please. And we start in 1777 with this, in my opinion, rather poor depiction of an African wild dog made by a Dutch painter. And in his notes that he makes some apt observations about the African wild dog, about their taxonomy, their anatomy, and their behavior. But he concludes by saying they are malicious and have very sharp teeth when they bite. And although this is just one isolated record, I think it's actually exemplary for the way a lot of colonialists viewed African wild dogs. Next slide, please. Just have a look at this quote from a British naturalist describing the wild game of Zambezia. Let us consider for a while that abomination, that blot upon the many interesting wild things, the murderous wild dog. It will be an excellent day for the African game and its preservation when means can be devised for this unnecessary creature's complete extermination. As you can see, I've attached some photos of wild dogs puppies just to show you what that abomination looks like. But unfortunately, words like these were not just empty threats. Next slide, please. Because in a lot of countries in Africa, the destruction of wild dogs was actually institutionalized. And there were documents going around like this, where the government gave people money to kill wild dogs. And as you can see here, you would receive 5 shillings per wild dog, which if you adjust for inflation would be about £22 now. So if you take into account that wild dogs live in groups of up to 40 individuals, being a wild dog bounty hunter would have been a rather lucrative job. And sadly, these kinds of programs were really, really successful. In 1900, there were still about 500,000 individuals left in Africa. And in only 100 years, this was reduced to only 5,000. Next slide, please. But as we move into the 21st century, wild dogs face a whole new set of threats, with one of the most notable ones being climate change. And although I can imagine many people would not necessarily associate global warming with a tropical predator that's actually already adapted to live in a warm environment, wild dogs are also badly affected by it. And this has everything to do with the fact that they hunt during the day, chasing their prey for up to an hour. As temperatures rise, it literally gets too hot for the wild dogs to hunt. And it has already been shown that this reduces their survival and hunting success. Next slide, please. And the reason that they have this activity pattern is actually tightly linked to some of the features that make wild dogs so unique. Amongst the African predators, wild dogs are somewhat of an underdog. They are way smaller than lions, for example, and hyenas. So lions are able to kill wild dogs, and hyenas often steal their prey. So to compete with these bigger predators, wild dogs have to be clever. And one of the ways in which they do this is by avoiding the bigger predators by hunting during the day when lions and hyenas are still inactive. But in order to compete for prey with these bigger predators, wild dogs have also come up with some clever solutions. And one of the main ones is that they live in big packs. And they hunt together using elaborate strategies and tactics, which allows them to catch prey that would be way too big for a single wild dog. And they do this with an astonishing success rate of about 80%, which is about 3 times higher than the success rate of a lion, for example. But this cooperative behavior is not just limited to hunting. Wild dogs also take care of the sick individuals and the old individuals within their packs. And taking care of the pups is done by the entire pack, feeding them and guarding them. And I think this is one of the main reasons that wild dogs deserve a lot of our love. They show us that we can achieve more when we work together. Thank you very much for listening.
Yes, brilliant. Thank you, Tom. Yeah, there's a good call for collective action at the end there. Of course, when we want to deal with all the stuff that we've got going around at the moment. But yeah, no, fantastic. Did a good job. And then finally, we're coming to the end of our tour. And this last but certainly not least, we come to Europe. And our representative speaker, Erica McAllister, who's a senior curator of Diptera flies at the Natural History Museum, where I am now. Erica has been an advocate for flies her whole career, having presented on series such as the Infinite Monkey Cage and participated in Ugly Animals Museum Show-Off. So it's no stranger to promoting unloved animals. And in this case, Erica will be talking about Fonseca's seed fly that resides quite close to where she is now, I think in the Cairngorms. So thank you very much for presenting it from the van that you're in. Yeah, please talk to us about this fly.
Hi, everyone. I don't think I've ever given a talk from a van before. I don't even know where I am in the UK, which is quite amusing. But yes, I'm going to talk about flies, and I've been listening to all the previous talks, and I'm laughing at you describing your animals as unloved or unknown, considering every day I have to fight so much open hostility when it comes to the group of animals that I'm promoting, the flies. These are the most maligned creatures on the planet, I think. It doesn't matter where you are, in which continent, they're the ones that get the most abuse. And this is the most unfair situation these beautiful creatures get. So look, this slide, if I can, this shows you how much everybody hates these creatures. If you go online and you will look, there are so many ways that we can kill them. You can sit in your living room and kill them. People tell me daily about swatting them. And yet I'm trying to persuade you that you need to save them. We need to save them for our environment, because we very much do. Now I'm talking about Europe, and Europe is arguably one of the most described continents in the world. We have a long history of going around, random people like me in vehicles running up and down the country describing flies. And not just flies, all creatures. But what is amazing, in the UK, we have over 7,000 species described already of flies. That is more species of fly than there are mammals on the planet. So there is a lot of it. We know this, that we can extrapolate that as a Europe, we can extrapolate globally. There's even flies in the sea. There's flies in Antarctica. I see they weren't on the slide earlier, but they're very, very important. But when most people think of conservation of rare species, they go straight away for the charismatic megafauna, including the wild dogs and the condors. They don't necessarily think about the tiny little flies. So many people just associate flies as the ones that turn up in your house or your garden, but I'm going to talk about one that's incredibly rare. In fact, this one is so rare, it's only found in one stretch of sand dunes in Scotland. That is it. That is the only place in the entire planet that has been described, and it's the Fonseca seed fly. Look at it. The anthemiids, the family it's from, are described as small, drab and grey, which is never a great start. Nobody knows why it's called Fonseca seed fly. It's because of the Dipteris Fonseca, who was a great person, which all of you go, oh yes, I've heard of that Dipteris, amazing conservationist. But it was named in honor of him, and it is one of the least studied animals ever. In fact, this whole talk is basically about what we don't know. And I want to do that to highlight that how most of the fauna on the planet, the insects, of which flies are one of the top 4 mega diverse groups within, we don't know anything about. No money, no effort, and no conservation gone into these ecosystem engineers. So this has been described as now being put on the UN sorry, I can't see this, on the red data species list. It's endangered. It's one of the few flies in the world to be classified as endangered. There have been others that are classified now as extinct, not in the UK. But the problem is about these flies is that even though we've been studying them maybe for a little bit, we know nothing about their life history. We know nothing about their ecology. We don't know what they feed on. We don't do anything. And this is extraordinary considering how long we have known about this species. So this is found in a beautiful part of Scotland. It's found in the sand dunes. And why this links in with the environment is that we know these sand dunes are very, very fragile. These sand dunes are some of the most, am I up to date with my, I'm a slide ahead, this is why. Never do a talk in a camper van. So here we go. These sand dunes, here we go. These have now been, these are very threatened. In fact, when it comes to climate change, we know that these sand dunes are not only impacted by changes in sea level, but also because when we've got habitat disturbance the other side, there's nowhere for the sand dunes to retreat. So what we've done is we've created a double whammy or a triple whammy of threats going on to these species of flies that live along these sand dunes. So you've got sea levels rising, which is causing the sand dunes to move back. But if they can't go back because of development, because of the way the habitat is going that way, you find that these are disappearing faster than many of the other habitats. Now, where this fly is found is so problematic because they want to build golf courses here. Now, this is even better. So not only does the fly have to face climatic issues, it has to face human impact issues. So this is a big problem. We also know nothing about how it lives. For example, here is what we think is maybe a maggot of this fly, but we don't know because it's really difficult to identify maggots. We have very little funding when it comes to looking at the genetics of this. They have done 3 surveys. They have found very few, less than 100, and each time they've done that, and they still haven't incriminated. This fly was discovered in 1965. It was written up in 1989, and 30 years on, we still don't know anything. None of you others can say anything about your species like that. And this is so bad because, as it was pointed out earlier, all these species are important. So we have now flies that we know these adults are pollinators. We know their larvae interact with the environment quite importantly, whether they're herbivores, whether they're biological control, whether they're all of these different things, and yet we still don't know anything about them. So my plea is to take a step closer and look smaller, because there's so much more we need to fight to save. Thank you.
Yes, amazing. Thank you so much, Erica. Yeah, we need to fight against those golf courses. So yeah, we don't destroy the habitat of these amazing creatures. But that brings us to the end of our world tour and what a ride it's been. There have been many questions coming in from the chat that we'll get to in just one moment. So do you want to bring all the panelists back together, the speakers back together? Yeah, I'd just like to thank you all for being an advocate for your species. And we'll get to the questions from the Q&A in the chat in just a moment, but I just want to ask a more general question to a few members of the panel that's relevant to our theme about sort of like the synergies between like tackling the climate crisis and sort of the loss of biodiversity. So I guess it's quite a broad one. I don't know who I'll ask first. Maybe Lloyd, like how can we utilize biodiversity in tackling this climate crisis?
So one of the biggest feedbacks that's reducing carbon in the environment is increased productivity in the polar regions. And in fact, if you look at increased productivity in the polar regions, the combination of all of them is the biggest natural feedback reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The northern march of the forests in Siberia is possibly the biggest. Not many people know that the next biggest is the loss of glaciers and ice shelves in Antarctica and the new growth of life on the seabed. And that's the second biggest reduction of carbon in the environment globally. So the big areas where, if you like, biodiversity is fighting back against climate change is in the polar regions. And because we only have people going there for short periods of time, the number of people working on it is tiny. So our understanding of more than just a gross number is very small. And our understanding of the biodiversity is tiny. We only have one specimen preserved of one of our species of icefish. So there is literally nothing known about that. And if you talk about genetics, we have more work on fruit flies than any other group of animals near enough. They're sequenced and massive amounts of money goes into fruit flies. We have nothing like that in any of our 20,000 species of biodiversity.
I think Eric would like to rebuttal on that point.
Well, that's a bit unfair, because if they were studying the ecology of fruit flies, that may make sense. But you know that this is basically they're studying it for humans and human understanding.
Not true. Not true. We know more about the ecology of fruit flies around the coast of Australia, down the Queensland coast, than we know about any Antarctic fish.
Do you know about, is this Tephridids or is this Drosophilids?
It's Drosophilids. It's the fruit flies down that coast. They know how quickly they're mutating. They know how quickly they're evolving. They know how fast their distributions are changed. Ari Hoffman's got a group of 25 people working on it.
Well, maybe that one. But in the UK, in agromyzids, in this family, of which there's another 160 families of flies, we could argue, I don't know enough about fish, sorry, but I know that there's been a lot more research on different types of fish. So that was unfair.
Yeah.
In Amazonia, 90% of invertebrates are probably undescribed.
Yeah.
I'd say more than that. We worked out there was a recent paper looking at one type of fly, one family of fly, and the bizarre estimate is 1.8 million species in that one family. Now, hopefully that's completely wrong, but that just goes to show how many undescribed species of fly there probably is.
And we have a whole new phylum living on the lips of a lobster that has only been described once.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So there's a lot more for us to understand before we try to tackle this problem. Was definitely. So that was sort
I think
of
the key thing there is that there's a lot of invertebrates, and there's a whole lot more, just going on everywhere. I love the one that lives on the fish. That's quite cute.
Amazing. So that was. Paul, do you want to jump?
I think again, we don't want to get bogged down into who's best or who's got the most deserving case. I think we'd all agree that we celebrate all of these things, but I think you want to find, in the context of climate change, where the weakest links are, and I think it's cryosphere. And I think if you look in the biological world, and everything bound up in cryosphere, and I think coral reefs are probably a good example of, at the biological level, the sensitivity. Yeah. And I think the sheer fact that you're looking at viability decline in whole systems, ecosystem levels, and of course, reefs are relying on seagrass meadows, etc., back to your sea cucumbers and all the critters that keep those things going. It's the ecosystem level and ultimately the planetary level. These things are all actually connected. And our challenge is to get it out to the bigger world, not least policymakers, that there are no quick fixes here. If you don't address the weakest links in the system, then everything's going to fall behind it. I think I would put the Amazon in there as well as a critical ecosystem level that's right on the edge. If we don't get those things across, everything we're talking about is going to go. It'll just be the question of when.
I was going to say it's not just tropical, not just coral reefs, and not just Amazonia, but the tropics in general is where species richness reaches its terrestrial and marine asymptote, and where changes is happening most quickly, and where more species have restricted ranges. And where agricultural deforestation frontiers are, and where species reach their thermal limits and such like. So it's really where the battle for biodiversity is won and lost.
And the terrible thing is, it's not even a case of we don't know the information. We don't need a pile of scientists to run off and tell you more about the fly or whatever it is. We know enough about the fragility of these species and the essential role that most of these things play and the connectivity. There's no excuse, but it's just some of it's lack of awareness, but most of it is just apathy and it's not being picked up. God knows what they're talking about currently at the biodiversity meeting up in COP, but it's better be bloody realistic, because it's easy to get lost in the minutiae of these conferences and things, and the reality checks just get lost. And all our critters help to illustrate that, I think.
Yes, amazing. Well, thank you so much for the discussion. I feel like we could have gone on for another whole hour and a half talking about this, but I have to bring it back to some questions we got from the chat, more sort of each of your animals related. And we got one for Abby from Hannah Barker, who was asking, are there any genetic issues, diseases in the current condor populations due to interbreeding in captivity?
Hey Hannah, thanks for your question. I also saw one on what they eat, so I'll combine the two. First of all, they eat carrion, so dead animals, whether that's they kind of utilize every part of the dead animal. They're not too fussy, and tends to be large-bodied, medium-bodied mammals, or stranded marine mammals too. And in terms of genetic disorders, not that I'm aware of, and most papers and research that's been published has sort of agreed that they've been very, this is part, like one of the main points they focused on during the captive breeding program, so that they didn't sort of interbreed. So there's sort of only a few lines of families within the kind of wild population now, obviously, because the numbers were so reduced. But they tend to reintroduce different species into areas where the kinship isn't so tight. So there's not been too much problems there.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Abby.
So can I interject there as well? There is a nice story that goes around there with a condor, which was when the condors were taken into captivity, one of the first things that happened was they were fumigated, and 2 species of parasites were actually rendered extinct by the conservation intervention to save condors, which is, again, I think parasites need their stories telling as well, and we sort of forget about them. But that was what happened in the 1980s and was emergency room conservation measures, but also part of a story too.
Yeah, no, for sure. Sort of like I don't know whether it's like sort of speciesist in a way. I mean, like trying to protect the condor at the.
We just didn't realise they were new species at the time.
Yeah.
That was
There's
the
the
problem.
same with a rhino botfly, which obviously never wins hearts and minds of many people, but its habitat is critically endangered, and thus it's probably one of the rarest insects out because of where it's decided it wants to live. But yes, it doesn't win any pretty pictures, models.
And Lloyd, your talk about the ice fish garnered quite a bit of discussion in the chat and many questions which you've seen. But one that was quite interesting was how many legs did that spider have that you held up, and if you can you
can count them for yourself. It's got 10. So the sea spiders in Antarctica have radiated, and around 24 to 25% of the species of sea spiders live in Antarctica. And that's on a continental shelf that accounts for around about 10% of the world's continental shelf. So they're more than twice as diverse in the Antarctic as they are on average for the rest of the planet. And they're as or more diverse there than anywhere else. We don't get any of the common crabs and lobsters in Antarctica. They can't cope with the cold. So none of what's known as the reptant decapods live there. And the sea spiders have radiated out to fill the gap in the ecosystem that they've left. And because of that, some of them have got very large. And they've also moved out from just being 8-legged. And many of the bigger species have got 10 legs. Some have got 12. So we've got decalopodids, dodecalopodids in Antarctica, where all the shallow water sea spiders everywhere else are just 8-legged. The biggest in the UK is about 13 or 14 millimeters across when it stands up. Biggest in the Antarctic is 70 centimeters across, and he's 3,000 to 5,000 times heavier than the biggest sea spiders that we get in Europe. So yeah, 10 legs on that one, and some of them have 12.
Crazy, you've got so many legs. And won't let you go away too quickly, Lloyd. We got just one more. And from Archie Robertson, it was like, is there any way to protect the ice fish?
Yeah, there are ways. So people are now talking about egg repositories and DNA repositories, so that even if we lose them at some stage in the future, assuming we can get cold areas back, we can repopulate. And in 400 years' time or 500 years' time, we'll have technologies that we don't have now. So that might well be possible. We also have captive breeding programs for many of the species that we think are important to try and keep going on the planet. And there are cold aquaria around the world. We've got one in Cambridge. There's about 8 or 9 around the world that you could keep these things alive long term. And we're doing that for the iconic species that look like us, but we're not doing what I think of as the strategic. What are the really unique species? What are the unusual species? What are the ones that give us the diversity that we have? And why are we not doing that for those species, as opposed to one of, I don't know, 80 species of wild cats, where biologically they're not that different from each other?
I think I would echo Lloyd's point about cryopreservation should be an obvious must-do component of any species conservation response, and yet it still really struggles to come into any kind of action, not least for these kind of things. There's no excuse, no excuse for doing it, for not doing it now. And there's an all-out biodiversity crisis. Have a breeding program, and that's my background. Try and amplify that for 1 million+ species. How are you going to do it? Yeah, the least we can do is cryopreserve as much as possible, and again get the message out that these things can only be viable really if you keep a natural system going. But it's a multiple front. But these are obvious, and it's criminal not to be doing it. The technologies are there. Are they being properly utilised and marshalled accordingly?
I agree with Paul. I think it's just a matter of money and will.
Yeah.
I think, well, because conservation, ex-situ conservation, is mostly driven by zoos, but zoos are also driven by what people want to see. So I guess maybe it's events like this which propagate an interest in ice fish, and people go to see them, and then it becomes worthwhile keeping them, because there is some circularity in people with what's kept in zoos, which is what people want to see. Obviously, zoos do still keep species off out of the public eye, which need conservation, but it's still dominated by things people want to see. So.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for bringing up our theme and the reason why we actually do hold this event. That's exactly it, is to shine a spotlight on these, unloved, obscure, underappreciated animals and show why they're meant to be appreciated. But yeah, thank you, Alex. So next question is for Timon from Susan O'Connor, is how is a dingo and the wild dog different?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Susan. So a dingo is an actual wild dog. So those are the descendants of domestic dogs that were taken to Australia. And the African wild dog is not a wild dog in that same sense. So the African wild dog, in my opinion, has quite a confusing name, because wild dogs diverged from the dog lineage about 2 million years ago. But again, this name, African wild dog, was kind of, some argue, pushed by colonial governments to make it sound like it's a feral dog, and in that way to make it, well, to sort of encourage people to eradicate them when they come and eat your cattle. So many people now are arguing that we should maybe call them painted dogs or even painted wolves, to sort of get rid of this connotation of a feral dog.
Oh, cool. Yeah, thank you very much. I hadn't appreciated sort of like the nomenclature around the wild dog, but that makes a lot of sense. Awesome. Cool. I think that brings us sort of the end of the questions that were on YouTube. But since we're having such a good discussion around sort of getting more research about these animals that we know very little about at the beginning, I just sort of wanted to bring that back to sort of a question regarding COP and what our sort of our goals and aspirations in the biodiversity COP should be. Should we be looking to sort of prevent extinctions across the board, or should we sort of be actually looking to preserve and restore functionally intact ecosystems that are better able to give us those ecosystem services that we would like to provide, rather than, it's not my opinion, but people would say, other than spending money on the species that are going to go extinct anyway and aren't actually that functionally relevant to the working of ecosystems. I'll give that to anyone who wants it.
Well, it could be a false dichotomy. I don't think you have an either or. I think some of the stories you've heard today, choosing a species is easier said than done. And just to recognize the connectivity and ultimately, if you don't have a viable ecosystem, you're looking at, a pretty bleak future. So our role as humanity at this point in time is to try and preserve as much of that biodiversity as we possibly can, not make those kind of either or decisions. By sheer practicality, you'll never have 1 million fly programs and the rest of it, or coral, but we can do what we possibly can at the individual species level, and more, if nothing else, to illustrate and highlight and get into active policy the ecosystem level conservation response. And that will only happen, guys, if we really recognize the true threat that these systems are facing. And currently we're not doing that, or I think we're falling short of doing that. And that's partly providing an excuse for policy to actually just go on as it's currently doing. We need to really pick up the sensitivities at all these levels, species through to whole system and ultimately global connected systems. And if we're not doing that, we give the policymakers an opportunity to say, well, we never realized how serious it was. So you can't just rely on something's formal status. Is it robust enough? And that's why iterative assessment is super critical. We need all this skill we're hearing from people to really inform the true reality of the sensitivity of the species or the system. And if that's not done, it's difficult to imagine the robust policy will be there. Even though we know it's pretty dire, it's probably a lot more sensitive than is currently acknowledged with formal assessments, in my humble opinion.
I completely agree.
Sorry, Erica, go on.
No, I completely agree with that. But I think something we need to do more is to communicate that better. Then we need to communicate why the fly is important in that ecosystem you're talking about, why that coral is, all of these things. We need to be better at I took a load of people to see some maggots today, which is not your average thing, but these are pine hoverfly maggots, and they're very, very endangered. They're only found in these tiny little areas, but it was showing them how these maggots interact with the environment they're in, how they're in this saproxylic ecosystem, and how birds need the trees that they're doing, and how everything leads to everything. And this is where I know us insect people have failed, because we've been shouting about insects without, properly going, look, in a way, we're bird food. And I know I don't like doing that, but I think we kind of, to win over the public more, to highlight how important all these species are, we need to get better at communicating about the relevance of all of them.
Yeah,
both of those are absolutely right. We're already past the point where we're losing ecosystems.
Yeah.
So we have an ecosystem that is associated with ice in the Arctic, with sea ice in the Arctic. Arctic sea ice is going. There's nothing we can do about that. The warming trend we have in this planet and the carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere and the other climate relevant gases, there's a 20 to 30 year lag from what we do to the effective temperature on the planet. We are not going to stop temperature rising for the next 20 to 30 years. And by the time we get there, large scale sea ice in the Arctic will be gone. Those Arctic sea ice associated ecosystems will be gone. That might not be the first proper ecosystem to go, but it's going to be amongst the first. There are others that are going too. And we can't stop that happening now. What we can do is reduce the number of ecosystems that disappear by forcing as hard as we can on places like COP26 to get our policymakers to go as hard as they can on the reduction of climate relevant gases and forcing measures. So we must push harder for changes in our infrastructure, changes in our transport, changes in what we eat. We must force that, because if we as a race and a species don't care enough to try and stop that, we will get what we deserve, which is the large-scale loss of ecosystems around the world. And that's not just animals and plants that are nice to have around and see. A huge amount of our biotech and our medical resources come from things that we find in biodiversity. And in the next 100 years, the capacity to find new antibiotics, I've got people in my group now looking for antibiotics in species that we've not screened before, and we just don't know how to grow them, screening their DNA, screening the bugs that live on them. And if we lose whole ecosystems, we lose a massive repository that we could find in the future for pharmaceuticals and for biotech.
Yeah,
sure.
Definitely.
I think just to sort of reiterate what everyone said as well, I think there's still a huge sort of like protectionist kind of movement within governance and policy of biodiversity. So countries tend to kind of focus, a lot of country policy tends to focus on the biodiversity in their own country. Yeah, like what you were saying, that, when the Arctic ice sheets collapse, that's going to have global consequences, and every ecosystem on the planet will be transformed. So it's kind of like looking at the broader picture and looking actually at how every single ecosystem on the planet will be triggered from another ecosystem. So there's not one ecosystem that's sort of safe from this, from climate change. Every ecosystem will change. And I think it's time, with COP15, hopefully there is progress that, countries actually come together and agree on an area, especially on looking at areas as well that kind of transcend national borders, and just kind of focusing on the biodiversity there as well.
So building on that idea of that false dichotomy, that I think it is a false dichotomy, I agree with everyone else, between sort of single small or large areas and what we're going to protect and what we're going to restore. Sort of, building on, I guess, Erica, were you in the Caledonian pine forest this morning then in Scotland? If you're looking at pine hoverflies, then yeah. So we think about Caledonian pine forest. What's that down to, like 5% of its original extent? But we are restoring that now, and you could say, well, it's down to 5%, so we forget about it. But we don't do that, do we? We're investing massively in trying to rewild and restore that system and save not just only pine hoverflies but capercaillies and everything else. So I think there's no system which is too small or too damaged to restore, because even if it's lost species, we can still save other species. So I think, you know, it is all and certainly not nothing when it comes to these sort of choices. And species can go down to, you know, Mauritius kestrel down to 5 individuals, for instance, and now into the thousands. So there's plenty of conservation success stories to talk about.
Yeah, but Alex, I would agree, but I would just add to that. You could have a sea full of corals, as indeed some of these counts are. There's billions of them. But there's no safety in numbers if ocean chemistry changes so much that you can't be a coral in that environment. You know, the physical environment at Earth system level can change so much that you just don't have the ability to rally round and species to bounce back. It can, and not say it can get that bad, it is that bad. And we're in this transitional state, like putting your hand over a campfire. If you pull it back quick enough, you may get away with minimal damage, but we're just leaving it hanging over there. And if you're in a primate threat assessment group for Amazonian species, are you asking the question, what's happening to cryosphere? What's happening to cascading tipping points from the Greenland ice sheet, etc.? How will this affect climate patterns, etc.? We don't think about those kind of things, these externalities, these teleconnections, etc. That's got to come in. So there's a professional job to do to really get these threat assessments robust enough that they're fit for purpose and to make sure they feed into policy. And it's every person on this planet has to be the conservationist now. You can't leave it to a bunch of professionals. We're all in it together, just like these animals are we've been talking about tonight. It wouldn't be too difficult to show how they're absolutely all totally connected.
Sure. Yeah, so it's always local and distal drivers, and we have to fix both, basically.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm going to have to bring the Q&A to the end there because we've got our poet who to give us a thing. I'd like to thank everyone for such an interesting discussion post. It definitely gave me something to think about and when we went forward. But I would just like to thank all the panelists now, and now we can move on to our audience who has an opportunity to vote for their favorite animal and who's been convinced most. I know, speaking in the discussion, that I'm sure all of them have won you over now, but give you a chance to show us best. So there's going to be a Mentimeter link in the chat. So if you want to click on that and vote away. But while you're doing that, let me introduce Dr. Robin Lamboll, research associate with Grantham Institute, but also has a penchant for poetry and was crowned UK Slam champion in 2019. Tonight he will recite a poem bringing together our theme to life. So thank you, Robin, and please go ahead. I can't wait to hear it.
Oh, thank you for having me, and lovely to hear about all these wonderful animals. Unfortunately, my poem is just entitled Before Being Yetis. A shy creature skulks through the Himalayan snow. It's more than man-sized, though rarely photoed. It's shiny-furred and can go around on 2 legs. It's the Tibetan blue bear, though it's really brown instead. It's probably the true story behind the Yeti, and yet we see no documentaries named after these. It's like actually existing makes them less interesting. We don't know quite how rare these shy blue bears are, but their icy homes melting, and humans are carving the mountains to make hostels, highways, and schools. Soon the bears may survive only in zoos. Worldwide, species after species is dissolving into mystery, into a maybe Earth has a patch of microclimate habitat, a lost world, Loch Ness, Avalon, unfound yet. But as nets grow finer and climates unkinder, it's harder to hope that these species survive in a world of drones and mobile phones that more and more record the same story. Everywhere warming. Humans morphing land into morphine drips, sending banded antbirds on one-way trips understoried by the way we inflict weird trees and new types of grit, replacing wild dogs with slaves who will sit and worship the odd beasts, who will sniff coral reefs, not to rue what we've done, but to see if we can find any megalodon. There are stories hidden deep in the unknown, but more stories die daily in the rainbows of our genomes. Doesn't the white blood of the icefish hold whispers of when the Antarctic first grew its vortex? Isn't a sea cucumber's body a scroll, its symmetry a memory of when it didn't stroll but fixed its stead and filter-fed? Isn't the whole of every breathing thing a triumph beyond imagining? Aren't even flies dying faster than nature is birthing them? All mysteries are fragile. Some only break. Others, held gently, hatch. I didn't know exactly which animals we were going to have today, so I haven't included condors in that poem. Fortunately, I have already written a poem which is a celebration of various different birds of prey in the style of several rappers. This has a line about Andean condors in the style of Nicki Minaj, so I'll read that instead. No Andean condors don't. No Andean condors don't. No Andean condors don't harm livestock until their livestock. To find fresh flesh, follow vultures who can smell. Mutualistic coexistence, because they need our beaks as well. We can bite through hide. And even crush up bone each day we fly. Marathons around our home. What I see, could it be someone left a fresh kill for me? So we tear that body open for cocktail pills and potions that make us fall like dominoes when we start overdosing. Oh my God. Look at her beak. Look at her beak, beak, beak. Thank you, that's all from me.
Amazing, that was fantastic. Amazing. So thank you so much. Did not expect Nicki Minaj to be coming out tonight, but I'm really, really glad it did. So yeah, I think we're just waiting on the results to come in. My colleague's going to be sending me those results over soon, and we'll be able to crown one animal the winner of the evening, even though, yeah, as I said earlier, I think everyone's won everyone over, putting a good pitch for why we need to preserve everything and how important and integral that is to maintain our system integrity so that we have a habitable and sustainable planet to live on in the years to come. And hopefully this will be able to enthuse just like the people and the decision makers held together by a knowledgeable public, which will actually then give these results that we need and desperately need for this transformative change in the future. So just bear me one moment and I will share the results. Wait 1 second, that's it. And there we go. So if you'd like to put that from the center, Sam, we will be able to show that the ice fish, the clear and dominant winner of this version of the Unloved Animals Club. We do typically have an image of ice fish with a crown on, but I don't think we have that today. But just imagine it. And yeah, thank you so much, Lloyd, and well done. Oh, you're muted, Lloyd.
Yeah, I think it's really important to echo that, especially what's been said by Paul, that it's all interconnected, and we might be losing things in the polar regions to climate change first because the cold regions go first. We're losing stuff everywhere. The deserts are expanding. We're losing Sahel areas. It's important that we think about biodiversity everywhere, and we think about the unloved animals because we just don't know about them, and we think about them across the planet. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And that brings that to the close. So that's unfortunately the end of our Unloved Animals Club. So thank you all the speakers for coming, talking about animals, being an advocate for not just the animals, but for all of nature and ecosystems. Thank you for everyone watching on YouTube, and I hope you got all your questions out. A recording of this discussion will be soon available to appear on the Great Exhibition Road Festival YouTube channel for you to watch again. And of course, share with your friends and colleagues if you want. All future events or recorded videos from the festival will be appearing on the new YouTube channel, so you get a new notification when a live event has been recorded. And just a few little things to plug just beforehand. If you're thinking as you as an individual and what you'd like to do to restore nature, or like you as an individual can seem like